Oh, by Jove and by Jehovah, you have set my heart aflame.
And to you, you Casanova, my reactions are the same.
I would sing thee tender verses, but the flair, lass, I lack.
Oh, go on, try to versify, and I'll versify back.
Well, let me see now. Cherry pies ought to be you.
Autumn skies ought to be you.
Mr. Pulitzer's prize ought to be you.
Romeo in disguise ought to be you.
Columbine ought to be you.
Sparkling wine ought to be you.
All of Beethoven's 9 ought to be you.
Every Will Shakespeare line ought to be you.
You are so enticing, I'm starting to shake.
You are just the icing to put on my cake.
You mean I'm yummy? Heaven's blue ought to be you.
Heaven too ought to be you.
Everything super do ought to be you. Asphodels ought to be you.
Orson Welles ought to be you.
Ankles like Kit Cornell's ought to be you.
Towels from Ritz hotels ought to be you.
Sweet Snow White ought to be you.
Ambrose Light,
Hey, that's good.
ought to be you.
Eleanor, wrong or right, ought to be you.
Errol Flynn, loose or tight,
Watch it.
ought to be you.
You are so exciting, I can't even laugh. Want to top that one?
If you're fond of biting, I'll bite you in half.
To continue, Whistler's Ma ought to be you.
Elliot's Pa ought to be you.
Everything hip hurrah ought to be you.
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 Ought to be you.